Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Schenkelberg.
And I'm Philip Sage with the Manaway Group in Australia.
Hey, Philip, it's good to talk to you. It's just at the start of the year here, and I think the recording will go out 3-4 weeks from now. But I'm hesitant because I saw a message that said it's official that we're not allowed to say Happy New Year anymore. But and definitely when this comes out, probably closer to February. But yet I fully believe that I'll hear that again and again over the next week or so.
You know me, I'm a rebel, so Happy New Year.
There you go. Thanks, Phil. The same back. One of the things, I think it was Larry George wrote an article, and it was kind of reanalyzing a data set that was somebody else put on. And he was talking about this idea that if the data set has no competition, then some of the software packages, and he had picked one or two of them, one of them in particular to complain about, is underlying is making the assumption that it is a competing risk model. And so he was trying to show that it makes a difference in the analysis. And that's about where I lost him. So when you mentioned this topic, I thought, yeah, maybe you could explain it so that I could understand it. What's going on here?
Well, competing risks are where you have two or more failure modes that are competing to win the failure prize, I guess. And what you're trying to do is understand which failure mode is the responsible for taking out the asset, if we're doing assets or products.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge, I think, what the gentleman you referenced was alluding to is that if there's no competition, then you can't assume or use a competing risk type of model. So one of the things we run into in the analysis of electrical utilities is there's often cases where there is no competition. Classic example is probably a wooden power pole. The predominant failure of a wooden power pole is rot, a cavity that develops at the ground line from the inside out. And what you're left with after 50 years is a tubular section of wood that might be an inch or two thick in the wall thickness, and the rest of it is a cavity that extends perhaps 3 feet below the ground and 3 feet or 5 feet above the ground.
Mm-hmm. And probably a way more fragile than a solid log.
It is more fragile, but it's not. It's surprising that the amount of strength that's carried in the outer wall thickness, that the inner core is not as substantial a contributor to the overall strength of the pole. So it's kind of like a steel pipe or a tube. Its strength is not quite as strong as a solid bar of steel or a round section of steel, but the same concept applies. It's just a different yield strength material in the form of the wood. But the challenge in power poles, at least here in Australia, one of the other things that can take out the strength of a power pole pretty quickly is termites. And so you have in some cases you have competition between which is going to weaken the pole to the point where it's no longer serviceable and able to support the gravity load or the wind load or the conductors in a safe fashion. And whether it's the termites or the rot, which I'll qualify as either brown or white rot, or a phenomena called a soft rot that tends to make kind of like a more of a gooey mess. We'll just lump rot together, and termites it's one of those two. However, if there aren't any termites in the hole, there's no competition. So you need to kind of understand the situation you're trying to analyze a little bit more broadly than just lumping them together and saying that these two failure modes are responsible. And if the failure modes, I believe, have to overlap on the timeline, meaning that there has to be some portion of the timeline where both failure modes are active. Because if there's not, if you have a timeline from 0 to 80 years, for example, and you have two separated distributions of failures, one due to termites early on at about 30 years and one at about 60 years due to rot, then when you pass through the 30-year distribution and you're still standing, you weren't actually in competition uh, with the termites. Uh,
All right. So that one of the things what I think what further confuses me about this is that from the little bit of distribution history and theory and all that kind of stuff is that if I remember correctly, the Weibull distribution is a member of what's called the extreme value distributions.
yep, yep, exactly.
And the way I understand it is that the extreme value distribution applies when there's competition. So you have 10 failure mechanisms that Al could take out let's not use PowerPole, but say your widget, and they're all competing at the same time. It's truly a competition to see who wins. And it's based on the idea is that it's a random chance that one of these 10 items is going to cause it to fail first. And that's kind of the classic description of when a extreme value distribution, of which the Weibull distribution is one of them, would be appropriate. And so like normal distribution is when there's an additive nature to the types of stresses it sees, and there's some other distributions that have a story behind them when they're theoretically appropriate. They're kind of built for that situation. Then on the other hand, I've learned that it's kind of bad practice to take a Weibull distribution that has like 4 or 5 different types of failures that are occurring and put it all into one chart. The math will give you a plot. You'll get a line because it doesn't know it doesn't know that this is failure mode A and failure mode B and failure mode C, but you should know as the analyst. And sometimes we see graphs where it gives you a signal saying, well, this failure mechanism dominated early and this failure mechanism dominated later, because you get like a hockey stick look to it or something like that. But I've heard plenty of practitioners say that if you have more than one failure mechanism at play, you should really plot them separately. And so that's where I get confused is, well, if I'm plotting the failure modes separately and censoring all the other failure mechanisms for that particular plot of failure mode A, I'm kind of getting rid of all the competition and only analyzing one. So I don't know if I explained my dilemma there a little bit, but
Yeah, and I think I'll just reference some work. I think I was reading Wayne Nelson's Life Data Analysis Handbook the other day,
mm-hmm.
um, and the suggestion there is that when you have say 3 different failure modes, that you should really plot 3 different Weibull lines on your paper. If you're doing it by hand or in the computer,
Yeah.
they should be 3 different data sets that are superimposed onto the same chart. And ideally, those 3 lines, from the 0.001% to the 99.99% range of unreliability for failure mode A should be separated in time from failure mode B line and from failure mode C's line, so that you don't have overlap, because then you truly have three independent failure modes that uh, are all capable of operating. And you mentioned, should you treat the failure mode B, or if it's A, B, and C along the timeline from the beginning of time to the end of time that they occur, should you treat B and C as right suspensions for A? And that I'm going to probably question, because if I pass through failure mode A and I don't fail, then I really don't have uh, a data pool comprised of equal chance observations. I really have three
Mm-hmm.
three data sets that are independent, and that it would not be appropriate to treat those that fail from a different failure mode uh, later in time as a right-censored observation of the failure mode A, because they aren't affected by failure mode A.
Yeah. Well, I had one example comes to my mind where I had the top level data and it was kind of the whole product level,
Mhm.
independent of what was causing the failure. And it was gave us a line and where they were able to use that to get a reasonable estimate of their future repairs and warranty claims and stuff like that. And it was actually pretty accurate at doing that. It got worse and worse the older the product got because they had, when I broke it down, they had um, five dominant failure mechanisms, a handful, a smattering of others on the Pareto, but the top five counted for probably 95% of the failures they saw. And the first one was installation. So but the problem was is installation damage could occur when this product was installed into the second location 2 years later. It was a device that pulled oxygen out of the air for people that uh, had to take oxygen as a prescription. And so instead of having a bottle of oxygen, they had this little R2D2 looking unit that would create or separate oxygen from the atmosphere and give them a higher concentration for breathing. So this device would get installed in somebody's home or put in it, and there was a pretty decent probability because of design problems that it would get broken and then it would be returned and fixed and then a new one would be installed. And these devices then moved depending on whether that person still needed the oxygen or not or whatever the reason was. And then it would go back to this rental company and then they'd install it again. So in the life of the device, it had multiple opportunities to get this installed damage, this
Mhm.
fracture to this cabinet. On the other end of it, they had a compressor in this thing that just wore out. It wasn't appropriate for the expected life of this product. It just tended to run out. I don't know, it was like 5 years or so. And these things are running nearly 24/7. Um, so I understand that the idea is that if it gets through the time frame of installation damage, the assumption is that that's it. That rest of those units will never, the only risk they've got going forward is this compressor. Now, the other three other things were almost in the noise compared to those two. And so when I showed them that plot with all these five lines on it, it says you really, you get some software problems, but not enough that it's going to make any difference in the overall life of this product. You got to fix the chassis from breaking when installed. You got to fix this compressor, and then we'll work on the other stuff. But the issue is that given the nature of the product, they could be reinstalling this thing at 5 years, and at that point, that installation damage is really competing with the compressor damage or failures. So I don't. It's not always a clear cut. This one only happens here, and this one only happens there. That makes it tough for me to know what kind of analysis to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. Uh, the data that I was referring to were probably a little bit more ideal. whereas you've got more of a, I don't know, I want to say renewal cycle, but you're reinstalling multiple times and starting the life over from an installation perspective, but
Hmm.
not from a compressor perspective. You're installing a 5-year-old compressor when you
Right.
install it for the fifth time. So it's an interesting scenario.
And what really was something and this is complete aside to the competing risk thing, is that we started doing a lot of fracture analysis to figure out, is this a cumulative damage? And we found out, no, when it gets dropped on a concrete stairs, it's going to break. And if it's not dropped, it won't break. So we kind of figured that one out. But in either case, though, is I just went straight to like ReliSoft's Weibull plus plus and ran the plot. What I didn't gather from Larry's article was, what was the problem of looking at a single or independent failure mechanism using a extreme value distribution?
Hmm. It's an interesting question. I guess I would think about that.
I didn't mean to put you on
Yeah,
the
yeah, no,
spot.
no. Stump the professor. My goodness. No, the challenge is the way I like to explain it is that if there's no competition, you can't use competing risks and the assumptions that go with that. And I guess another way to maybe discuss it would be to look at it from a reliability block diagram, where if we have failure mode A, B, and C and represent those by blocks A, B, and C in a series arrangement, then any of the three blocks can can down the system.
But then the reliability curve is unique to each failure mechanism.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
As opposed to what I did is I said, well, I'm going to take all three of those failure mechanisms and at the system level, just plot it all in one big batch.
one big batch. Yep. So
Right.
you'd have one super block representing the culmination of the three lower blocks, and it would have its own characterization and parameterization using one of the failure distributions.
Yeah. Now, if I'm doing a block diagram, I know that there's algorithms and software, and sometimes if it's simple enough, you can do it by hand, is you can come up with, well, what is the system level
Mhm.
probability of failure over time? And it may or may not be an, a common distribution that we can fit a line to it. Sometimes you can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a nice smooth curve necessarily, especially if you got three, independent failure mechanisms. It's just that the competing risks model, and that's why I'm going back to this. It's a extreme value distribution, which is kind of its classic thing. The trouble is that Weibull is so versatile. It gives you a line. I mean, it's just a bit of math, and I got all this, list of failures and times and other units that didn't fail, and I can fit a line to it. It's just that, it never dawned on me to compare what I get when I do the math on a block diagram to see if that compares to what I would get if I just fit a Weibull at it at the top level.
Yeah, I think you're going to get two different things, but mathematically, the approaches are equivalent. However, the goodness of fit probably at the top level of applying a distribution to somehow umbrella cover three distinct lower level failure modes is probably going to be difficult to find a mathematical representation that matches that reasonably well.
That's true. And you see it in some packages where they have, well, you put in the inflection points and we'll treat it as 2 stages or 3 stages and stuff
Hmm.
like that. And they do kind of these crazy manipulations to say, well, you really should be separating these. This is kind of what I'm hearing and what has been my practice in the past. Um, yeah, if the data doesn't give you, you're not getting a decent fit, then try something different. It will fit a curve to it. Doesn't matter what distribution
Sure.
you're using. A lot of the software packages will, well, you want a straight line, I'll give you a straight line, even though it has nothing to do with the data.
That's great.
you know, so that's one caution. Um, but at some point, let's say all three of the failure mechanisms, it was a compressor, a valve, and something else that wears out. And they're all competing in the same year 4 to 5, basically. They have a reasonably high probability of failure. Then they are truly competing risks. And then using a Weibull distribution should work
Hmm.
as I'm doing it as an extreme value distribution.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. No, I think so. If they're all, again reference back to the timeline. If they're all occurring at the same time, or there's overlap
Mm-hmm.
between those individual failure modes, then they are competing risks. It's only when they're separated in time and very distinct that you have individual failure modes, and that the they are kind of standalone. And when something doesn't fail with the first failure mode, or failure mode A, as we called it a little bit ago, then it really is you're mixing in data from failure mode B, and that shouldn't be part of failure mode A's analysis in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and I can already see the comment we're going to get on this one, Philip, is
Yeah,
like, how independent do they need to be? How separated? And I'm quite sure that's a continuum. And at some point, you just got to run it both ways and see which one makes a difference for you.
yeah,
Um, that it's going to be in the details of what kind of data sets we're dealing with, and for in my own experience, a good number of data sets I've seen with companies have been with such poor failure analysis that they don't know what was causing the failure. And if we know a little bit more information, we go, well, that one takes a long time before that happens. Um, but if they just say, oh, module A failed and it has 15 different things in there that are causing the failures, we're blind to what's really going on inside there, whether they're competing risks or not. And then we can't do the block diagram type approach because we don't have sufficient information to separate the failure modes or failure mechanisms.
yeah.
So
I
I hate it
mean,
when reality gets in the way.
yeah. I mean, it's an interesting challenge. You look at the world through a product lens. I look at it through more of an asset lens. But
Mm-hmm.
I've run into situations where, and again, I'll go back to wooden power poles, where
Yeah.
there are distinct patterns for the same species of wood that's been installed in the same region. So you have a lot of things that are all similar. That you may have a distribution centered at 70 years and another one centered at 40 years. But when you look at the stratification attributes of the data, you find out that the 40 years are have been preserved with creosote, for example, and the 70 years have been preserved with a carcinogenic pentane product many years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
so their susceptibility to rot is rather different. And if you were just to lump them together, having two distinct failure performances that are a result of the combination of the wood and the preservative that's used to preserve and retard the rot effect, then you would probably have a very difficult one high level equation to fit that with, because you'd have two distinct humps, and because you have two distinct humps, you really do have two different situations where the data needs to be kind of separated and treated in isolation to each other.
Yep. Yep. No, I get that. It's one of the things I find in doing statistics is I start asking questions about, well, what caused this, or why does this look like this, or what's going on here, or what's the story, what's behind the numbers, And I had one person years and years ago said, you don't need to know that to just run the numbers. And I said, well, I have a lot of different ways I can stick these numbers in the machine here and get you a plot, but which one will help you answer a question you're trying to answer is
Yeah.
if I understand what's behind the numbers, what's going on, how'd you collect the data, all kinds of stuff. And he got real quiet when I asked him, so how did you make these measurements? And is it any good? And he had no idea. So I finally got fed up with him challenging me on wanting to know more about what was going on, and accused him of not knowing whether his gauges were any good and sent him packing with a reference to a gauge R&R study. Come back when you have no good data. He never did come back. So I probably went and found somebody else. But it was something I hadn't thought of before. And I think when they are separate in time, I probably have seen those, especially like histograms, just a simple histogram of the data. You see two different humps, and it's like, no, there's something really different going on here. If it made a nice, normal curve or a normal-ish type bell curve looking thing, maybe skewed one way or the other, I'd be more confident and go, I can put this all together. But if there's 2-3 humps, I've seen them with all kinds of weird shapes in the histogram part, then you got to think it through a little bit more. And I think that's the takeaway for if you're looking at a stack of data, is understand what's going on and what's causing it to have these various different patterns that occur. And don't be afraid to ask questions and go find it, because that's, at the end of the day, somebody's trying to make a decision. I do. I look at data sets just for fun sometimes, but that's just me, I guess. That's a really convenient way to be avoided at a cocktail party, is start talking about statistical data sets you've analyzed recently.
Yeah. What do you do? Well, yeah. Just need a different elevator speech for that one, I suppose. But
that's it, exactly. But anyway, if you're listening to this and going, oh, I never thought of that. Well, hopefully that's something for you to consider and add to your bag of tricks as you look at data sets and such. If you've got any questions about it, this or other types of ways of thinking through competing risks, or whether if that's an appropriate approach, or if it's not competing, what do you do different? Let us know. Head over to accendoreliability.com/go/SOR. Go/SOR. And Philip and I and the other hosts of the show are available through LinkedIn and our About pages. And so there's plenty of ways for you to get in touch with us. So with that, Philip, sorry I put you on the spot there, but we'll probably have to come back around to this again, talk about some of the different analysis methods.
Sounds good.
That this would be appropriate for, one way or the other.
All right. Look forward to it.
All right. Thanks, Philip. Talk to you soon.
Bye now.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.